This is Brian Reads to you. I'm Brian. Today we are going to read
Princess Sophia by Brian K. Eddy, with illustrations by The Horses. Chapter 12. An Unwelcome Summons. For 2 days they rode at a brisk pace along the Great Circle Road. A brief stop at Castle Glug Glug gave Calvin a chance to restock his supplies and change clothes. Then it was back on the road to home. Now he gave Neighbor his head, saying, "Let's see how fast you really are, my friend." Like a shot they were off. The ground became a blur under Calvin's feet. He could barely breathe from the force of air striking his face. Sparks flew from Neighbor's hooves on the flinty road. In no time at all they had reached the garden which sat across from the hidden path to Castle Vigilance. It seemed a lifetime ago that Calvin had climbed it, excited to put into effect his amazing plan. They both washed in the small pond before enjoying a meal of fresh fruit. Although he wanted to be home as quickly as possible, Calvin took the time to cross the road and pick several horse hearts. He smiled at the memory of offering them to Andromeda and how she so easily took them from his hand. Returning to Neighbor, he climbed into the saddle and said, "Come on, boy. One more hard ride and we'll be home. Unless you're too tired." Neighbor bucked him off into the deep soft grass and snickered at Calvin lying there in a heap. "Very funny. I think you spent too much time with Andy." The sun had dropped just below the horizon the next evening when they arrived at Icthalane. The palace guards alerted the king and queen immediately that their missing son had returned. Fireworks suddenly exploded over the castle, and all the bells in the city began to ring. Calvin felt slightly embarrassed when he realized they must have thought him injured, or worse. He made his way through the gathering crowds toward the castle. Normally he would have given Neighbor over to the grooms for care. However, spending time in the kingdom of shadows had taught him a new respect for his companion. Calvin would take care of his dear friend himself. Once Neighbor was settled with a trough of cool water and a bale of the finest hay, Calvin entered the castle for his own apartment. He quickly cleaned up and put on some clean but simple clothes before reporting to the throne room. He knew there were questions to answer, and his parents would be waiting for him there. Calvin expected a rebuke and perhaps punishment for his long absence. Instead, he was greeted with hugs from both his mother and father. Then they sat down and discussed everything. Far into the night they went over his story. Often they went back and forth about details which Calvin could barely understand. Queen Constance asked him to draw for her the markings he'd seen in the tunnels near Holly Spring. King Kent seemed interested in the book he'd taken from the Dragon's Keep. Baird and Donovan joined them somewhere around midnight, and they had many questions of their own. Calvin got the impression that there were things going on which he did not understand. Dawn's first light poured in through the eastern window, and Calvin was exhausted. He could not think any more and just longed for his own bed. "Go, son, rest. We'll talk some more this afternoon," said Kent with a smile. "You have done very well." Calvin dragged himself back to his room and crashed onto the bed. His sleep was restful, but full of dreams. Sophia calling for help, the cavalry of shadows riding hard through the forests of South Pisannia, Sarah the witch telling him to look for a star in the darkest night. Calvin was exhausted beyond anything he had ever known. He slept all day that night and well past noon the following day. When he finally climbed from his bed, every inch of him was sore. Now it was time to unpack from his adventure, and what treasures he had. The Book of Pisannia went into the royal vault. It was priceless, not because of the jewels and gold, but because it was such an important piece of their history. Finally, they knew what caused the schism between their land and that of shadows. Calvin carefully stowed Sophia's jeweled dagger into his personal treasury. How and when she had hidden it in his bag was a complete mystery. He wondered if she would really have cut him. Alongside it sat the bow and arrows he picked up in the guard chamber at Vigilance. They were the finest he had ever used and would serve him well in the future. Last, he pulled from the bag a lumpy bundle of cloth. Wrapped inside was the braid of Sophia's hair he'd lopped off inside the well. It was smooth and soft as silk. He held it and thought of all they had done together. A faint smell of grass and flowers filled the room. He was about to set it into the box, but decided instead he'd like to keep it close. In the weeks that followed, Calvin was often questioned in great detail about the Shadow Kingdom. Names of the great families, where the royal stalls were, what rivers and lakes crossed the grassland. Was there food to be had, or would a traveler have to bring his own? However, most of all, he was asked about the tunnels. Over and over again they wanted to know where they were. How many men could pass through? Did he know of their entrances? Did he see any guards? He told them all he could remember. Near the end of September, Ichthyllain received a delegation from an unexpected place. A minister and a general from the Shadow Kingdom arrived. This had not happened since Kent was a very young man. Calvin was told not to attend, but allowed to listen at the door. "We present to you gifts from the Queen of Shadows," they announced. "A trio of saddles from our finest craftsmen. A selection of wildflower seeds for your garden, Queen Constance. Unbreakable nets made from shadow horsehair for your fishing fleets. And a special gift for the young prince, a travel food made from our own horse-heart fruits. It does not spoil. Further, it keeps horse and rider strong with just the smallest bite. Rarely have we given to others." "We thank you for these noble gifts," answered Kent with proper courtesy, "and welcome you to Ichthyllain. Your visit is most welcome, if unexpected. To what do we owe the honor?" "Our dear princess, Sophia, is nearing the age for marriage. Next spring she will turn 16, and it is our tradition that all the princes of the 6 kingdoms be invited to plead for her hand." Kent and Constance shared a glance, while Donovan tensed visibly. "Further, the judging of the suitors begins in 10 days' time. On October 1st, the Sunrise Gate will open to welcome the princes. It would be most disappointing if your Calvin were not there." Constance took the lead this time. "We understand the great honor you have lain upon our son. The betrothal of a shadow princess is a most auspicious occasion." The minister looked slightly ruffled. The general grew red in the face. "However," she continued, "a royal prince and heir to North Pisannia is not called for like a common stable boy. We will consider your request. Shall we prepare you rooms for the night?" Clearly offended by her refusal to promise Calvin's attendance, the minister spoke in a very low voice. "No, thank you. We must away to Pacama, where we anticipate a more compliant welcome." "Then go with our blessing," Constance smiled sweetly. though I am not sure Pakama will be able to provide a suitable prince. Georg doesn't even know how to ride yet. He is only 7, after all. The delegation stormed off in a huff and were out of the city before the dust had settled behind them. That evening, the king and queen met with all their advisers and generals. They debated long about events Calvin did not understand. The only thing clear to him was that his parents were set against his going back to the Shadow Kingdom. Baird argued for it, but with caution. Donovan and the soldiers all felt that war might come whether he went or not. The more he listened, the greater Calvin's frustration. He wanted to help his kingdom avoid a war, and if that meant asking for the princess's hand in marriage, then that is what he would do. And if he were honest with himself, he did not like the idea of her marrying someone else. Not one bit. Especially that twit from North Pisonia, Quell. He had been nothing but trouble last summer as they fought pirates together. That's when he made up his mind. Father, Mother, I will go to Shadows and court the princess. If that will secure peace for our kingdom, then it is the least duty I could perform. Son, we fear that Queen Hagatha plans to make war soon. We do not know when or upon whom. We do not want you to be in her hands when she unleashes her forces. She would keep you as a hostage to gain advantage. I met her, Father. She is harsh, but I don't believe she would do that. Donovan walked over and placed his hand on Calvin's shoulder. My prince, you know I would give my life for you. Trust me when I say that Hagatha Nostrum cares for nothing and no one but herself. But Calvin had worked himself into a fit. He was not going to let Sophia spend the rest of her life with someone who didn't love her. I'm going, Mother. Don't try to stop me because I will find a way. With that, he turned and rushed, not toward the doors or even a window, but straight for the secret passage behind the thrones. Before they could even shout, he was sliding down a chute and popped out near the kitchens. Just a short run to his rooms and he could be off. His travel bag was easy to fill. The dagger and bow came too. Around his neck he swung a braided string made from Sophia's luxuriant red hair. Upon it he hung a brooch. It was a fiery red opal surrounded by black pearls, a gift fit for a princess. He avoided the guards by clever use of 2 curtains, 3 side passages, and a suit of armor. Out the back door and into Neighbor's stall he ran. Hey, boy, ready for another adventure? Neighbor shook his head and pawed the ground. I'll take you to see Andy. The horse practically scooped him up and rushed out the door. Through the night they galloped. Calvin thought of his race to the mermaids so many years ago. Would this also end with a fight? Could they win against the mighty Shadow Army? For now, his only concern was to get to Sophia and make sure she was safe. Many hours passed. The sun began to rise behind them and cast a warm reddish-yellow glow on the mountainside ahead. It grew brighter by the second, and now Calvin felt its warmth licking at his back. That was when he realized that he was headed east, and the morning sun should be in his face, not his back. Neighbor suddenly turned to the right, and only just in time. A burst of dragonfire engulfed the field to his left and set it ablaze. Time and again the dragon swooped down to blast him, but Neighbor was too swift and too clever. They avoided the streams of noxious flame and managed to reach the wayside garden. Calvin had not intended to come this far south yet. Surely his father's soldiers would be looking for him on the road. Yet he was here now, and the circling dragon would not let him move into the open. His fear for Sophia's safety would not let him wait another second. He took a large grapefruit from a nearby tree and threw it as hard as he could north out of the thicket of protective trees. The dragon chased after it, and the fruit exploded into flaming pulp. Meanwhile, he and Neighbor raced south across the road and into the secret passage that led to Castle Vigilance. A rumble closed in behind them, and Calvin barely managed to squeeze himself and the horse behind an outcropping of rock. Into the cave billowed dragon fire. It burned the air and tasted like acid. They were singed, but okay. Lucky for him, it also burned away the magical plant that blocked his path upwards. Onwards and upwards, he whispered to Neighbor. The dragon seemed to think they had perished in the cave and was nowhere in sight as they climbed the mountain. Soon they reached the top and burst through the doors of the castle. There was no time to admire the artwork now. He'd planned to go straight out the southern door and find the tunnels he and Sophia used before. However, Neighbor had other ideas. The horse clattered down the central staircase, his mane sparkling brilliantly in the darkness. Calvin followed him down to the door and stopped, frustrated. Okay, genius, you led us down here. Now how do we get through the door? It takes both a Pizzonian and a shadow to make it open. Neighbor then smacked Calvin in the side of his head, driving him against the magical door. At the same moment his face and the string, made from Sophia's hair, brushed against the horse and dragon crest. The door flew open and Calvin fell in a heap. Neighbor nickered and stepped proudly into the chamber. Calvin looked around and guessed what was on his horse's mind. He quickly removed a glass ball from his bag, poured in the needed component, and rolled it against the eastern portal they had not opened last June. It glowed bright white for a few seconds, dimmed to red, and then exploded with a fantastic boom. Once the smoke cleared, Calvin could see the passage was clear. He mounted Neighbor and made haste toward his goal. Inside, he chuckled a little about the bomb and how scared Sophia had been. Last time, he'd only added a few drops so that the light would go on for hours. Now he poured the whole vial and it reacted so much faster. Unlike the western tunnels, this one was perfectly smooth on all sides. Every few miles there was a cistern of water cut into the rock. They rode hard and fast, resting only when they had to. Hour after hour the dark tunnel opened ahead and closed behind without any real changes. When Calvin could no longer keep his eyes open, they stopped for a nap. Neighbor was panting heavily, but still looked strong. Thank you, boy. I know this is hard, but we've got to save her. The stallion nodded slowly, drank some water from the cleft in the wall, and sank to the floor. Calvin leaned against his wide flank and scratched his friend gently. Together they dropped into a deep sleep. Once again, the prince dreamed of Sophia, but now she was older, taller, and acted very much like her mother. There was no sense of time within the dark tunnel. When they were tired, they rested. When they were hungry, they ate. And they ran, on and on and on. Finally, Calvin saw in the distance what he had been expecting, a wavering shadow cast by flame. Even before the kingdom of Pizzonia was established, they were miners, and dug through the mountains in search of all such minerals, metals, and jewels as could be found there. The shafts were an endless maze, and Calvin knew that if he traveled far enough to the east, this tunnel would inevitably connect with one of theirs. Drawing up to the torch, he hailed the squat man who chiseled at the wall. "Good day, sir. Tell me, what land are we in? Is this North Pizzonia?"
"Good day," he says, muttered the miner to himself, as if he doesn't know it is near midnight. "And what's a horse and rider doing in my tunnel, I asks you?"
Calvin had neither the time nor patience to quibble with someone who had breathed far too much mind gas. "What land are we in, sir? North Pizzonia?"
"North Pizzonia? Bah!"
And the little man spat on the ground.
"I wouldn't give 2 brass rings for North Pizzonia. They and their treaty with Pizzania. When Mrs. Hagatha is done with them, they'll wish they'd joined her straight away, I tell you."
This conversation was getting him nowhere fast, which was exactly where he would end up without help. Calvin drew his sword and set the tip near the man's neck. "I wish to leave the tunnels and visit Queen Hagatha. How do I get there?"
"Should have said so in the first place. Talking about North Pizzonia and all such. By the way you was riding, I says you left North Pizzonia yesterday morning. This here's Pisonia proper, not one of them there breakaway kingdoms. And I says further that Mrs. Hagatha gonna give 'em back to us once the war's over, and maybe a bit more too. I hears that the rest of the mountains ain't had shovel nor pick set in them centuries. There's plenty of gold and jewels to be had for a hard worker. So how do I just keep on keepin' on? This here tunnel joins up with the main shaft and takes you right down to Sunset Town. 4 or 5 hours if you use the whip.
I thank you, sir, Calvin replied, and tossed him a gold coin. He turned neighbor and set off with a new burst of energy. Behind him, the little man was busy trying to bend the coin in his teeth. Torches became fairly common, with the occasional bonfire lighting the larger caverns. More miners flashed by in his haste. Now Calvin was able to judge his speed, and after an hour came to a screeching halt. Off to the right was a narrow path that led upwards to a very tight passage. There, stuck at the hip, was the hindquarters of a large black and white horse. The poor beast was squirming and kicking violently. From the other side came the unmistakable sounds of a horse in terror, and the sharp crack of a whip. Despite his need to move on, Calvin simply could not let the horse suffer. He dismounted and climbed very carefully against the wall, trying to avoid the flying hooves, until he was at the trapped horse's side. With his sword, Calvin dug at the outcropping that held him in place. It was hard work and took longer than expected. Suddenly, a human shout rang out on the other side of the wall.
"Kick me, will ya? Why, I'll flay the hide right off'n ya, and make me a new pair of boots, I will."
Then crack, crack, crack! The horse whinnied in pain and stomped his legs backwards. His effort, combined with what Calvin had loosened, opened a large fissure in the wall, which grew and widened until the beast came free in a shower of dirt and rock. They tumbled backwards down the path, coughing and choking in the dust. When he could see again, Calvin made 2 startling discoveries. First, the miner who was treating his horse so badly was lying at his feet, dead. He'd held on to the reins with one hand and was pulled down in the tumble. In the other hand was a very long and ugly whip. The second discovery was that he knew the horse. After looking into the large, soft black eyes, Calvin lifted his gaze to the white star on his forehead. "Andreas," he whispered, "what are you doing here?" Numerous red and raw welts about his head witnessed to the cruelty of the miner. Andreas lowered his head, whimpered, and then nuzzled Calvin gently. He led his old friend over to where neighbor stood. Only then did Calvin notice the glaring difference between them. "Oh," said Calvin, with tears in his eyes, "you've lost your sparkle. Andreas, what have they done to you?" Reaching into his bag, Calvin pulled out a pair of horse hearts and fed them both to Andreas, then gave the horse water from his own flask and rubbed him gently where the rock had cut. "I'm afraid that is the best I can do for now, boy, and we have to ride. Can you still run?" Andreas and neighbor shared some horsey chittering, then a strong neigh. Andreas shivered all over, stretched each of his legs, and then set off in a trot down the tunnel. Calvin cried openly at Andreas' strength. He was willing to keep trying no matter how hard things were. Shadow horses were really quite amazing. Soon the 3 of them were up to a pretty good gallop, and the time passed quickly. Shafts of sunlight appeared frequently now, meaning they were much closer to the surface. Finally, after a sharp turn to the left, a huge opening led out of the mountain. Before them was the very same path Calvin had seen before leaving the city. He led them through the city and back to the Sunrise Gate, or the Sunset Gate as the people of Pisonia called it, until arriving at the small, comfortable inn he remembered from the summer. Chapter 13. In the House of Nostrum. Calvin paid the innkeeper handsomely to make sure that Neighbor and Andreas were well housed. He made sure personally to give them fresh water, hay, and a large supply of new apples. Only then did the tired prince settle into the great room and rest before the fireplace. He dozed slightly, but never quite stopped looking for danger. After all, the queen did tell him not to come back. "I see we have a traveler," floated a soft voice in the quiet room. "You must be quite the horseman indeed, to have journeyed from—" Here she leaned in close and whispered in Calvin's ear, "Ichthyllane, all the way to the Sunrise Gate in less than 5 days. That is unheard of. Why, even Hassenfeld's greatest racer, Wingfoot, would have trouble matching that speed." Calvin looked at the woman who was now seated beside him in a large chair. It was Sophia's Aunt Sarah, the court witch. "There is not much time, so be silent and listen." This new firmer voice from Sarah was very unexpected. "My sister has many plans. Some she does not share with me. There are those in our kingdom that do not agree with her. We want peace between all the 7 kingdoms. Your being here will act like a pebble in a pond. Ripples will move out and multiply. If you vie for Sophia's hand, this kingdom will never be the same. We will have to open our borders to outsiders, or they will have to submit to our armies. Many people are scared and do not want either, but I see no other path. All I care about," he blurted before she cut him off, "this isn't just what you care about. If we are not careful, war will roll over all the lands. Many, many people will die. I would give my life to keep Sophia safe. Then prepare yourself, young prince. I have a friend, a fellow magic user, who lives just inside the Sunrise Gate. He will give you a safe place to stay. Do not talk to him. He will act as if you are not even there. On the 3rd morning hence the princes will begin to arrive. Follow them as if a servant. Once you reach the stalls, I will hide you until the royal chase begins. You must win. If any other prince takes Sophia's hand, then all is lost. Do you understand?" Calvin nodded. Suddenly he felt very small and young in a world of very big adult problems. She smiled sweetly again. "I will take Andreas with me. You did very well to rescue him, but now he needs rest, care, and love. I will claim him as my own companion and bring back his sparkle. Goodbye, Calvin." His stay at the magician's home was exactly as Sarah predicted. Food and water appeared outside his door each morning and night, but not a soul even looked at him. The anticipated morning came, and through the gate rode a magnificent parade. At its head rode 4 princes, representing the kingdoms of Pisonia, as well as South Pisania. Calvin recognized his distant cousin Gus, son of King Bubby. He took care to cover Neighbor's saddle with rags, and traded his own royal suit for a simple riding outfit. With patience he found the perfect moment, and trotted out to join the servants of the princes as they moved down a narrow street. Hopefully they would all assume he belonged to some royal other than their own. Arriving at the royal stalls, Calvin wondered just how he was supposed to get inside and find Sarah, but she was far ahead of him. As the cavalcade entered, the princes rode to the castle. Their entourage made camp in various places on the grounds. Calvin rode further in than the rest, and was about to dismount when a stable boy took Neighbor by the reins. "Come with me. I've been ordered to bring a servant to her lady's adviser." Once they stepped into the shade of the thicket, Mr. Blonde stable boy transformed into the tall and quite beautiful raven-haired witch, Sarah. "You will stay under my protection tonight. At dawn is the chase, to see who is best suited to claim Sophia's hand." Calvin was appalled. "You mean whoever wins the race gets to marry her? What about love? What about liking him? Does she even get a choice?" She turned on him sharply. "Do not question our ways, Calvin. You may be a prince in North Pisonia, but that is many miles away. Here you are just another man in a country ruled by women." Again her voice softened. "No land is perfect. We try to do the honorable thing while still respecting our traditions. When you rule, you shall learn that destroying all things that have flaws leads only to all things being destroyed." Calvin lowered his head in shame. "Do not fret, my young friend. You are learning, as am I. Now go to sleep. I will make sure you are ready for the chase." Before the sun had risen above the eastern mountains, Calvin found himself astride Neighbor near the back of a large assembly of young men. The princes were there, forefront, and boasting of how fast they would go. Sons of the most prominent merchants, ambassadors, and generals from all the kingdoms sat in the middle. At the back were poor but sturdy boys who hoped to show off their skills that they might be allowed to join the army. They had little hope of winning and did not even dream of marrying the princess. Then there was Calvin. The same tall, thin man who served as master of the herd stepped forward and in a clear voice called out, "Riders, you have gathered to prove your worthiness to the queen. Our Princess Sophia awaits the winner, who will be honored with a chance to sue for her hand. Here in the royal chase, nothing matters but your horsemanship and your honor. Ride well, and be off with you." At his command, they scrummed, trying to find a clear path forward. Calvin avoided the middle of the pack and took the longer but faster route around them. In the distance, he spied Gus with a slight lead over the others. A dozen native shadow riders were hard on their heels in a line, with Calvin gaining quickly. The royal chase was not just a course for speed and agility, but endurance. For 24 hours, man and horse would be challenged. There were obstacles to be avoided or overcome, fallen trees to jump, rivers to ford. Only the greatest horseman could even finish. Yet Calvin, astride Neighbor, was a master. As the sun dropped into the red clouds of sunset, Calvin found himself neck and neck with the very short and very ugly Prince Lug of South Pisonia for the lead. Although each of the racers was mounted on a shadow horse, none of them were the incomparable Neighbor. The pair were holding back, waiting for nightfall before moving ahead. Sarah had warned him not to surpass the others too easily. Cheating was a common and time-honored practice in the royal chase. It would not do to draw too much attention until the very end. Lug glanced at Calvin and then lurched over to bump him hard toward a tree. Neighbor avoided it without losing a step, and then slammed back into Lug's horse in return. Beast and rider stumbled and then fell headlong into the stream they were meant to leap. In the gathering darkness, Calvin had an idea. Neighbor's brilliant silver sparkles would give away his position and allow the others to follow. With difficulty, he reached around and tucked the cloth blanket around his friend's mane, then his tail, and wrapped it tightly so that not a glimmer fell out. They disappeared into the night. Even Neighbor could not run forever. By the stars, Calvin knew that dawn was not far off. Time to rest and prepare for the final sprint. He pulled up under a large oak and gave the horse a deep draught of cool water. Following that were several of the horse-heart biscuits they were gifted by the ambassador. Neighbor perked up and seemed ready to go. "No, my friend, rest a bit. Your heart is stronger than your legs." "That is good, young prince." Calvin spun on the spot, drawing his sword. In the dim starlight he spotted a tall, hooded figure. She spoke again. "Some horses love their masters so much they will run themselves to death. You are very wise to let him breathe and cool." "Who are you?" Calvin panted, still a bit shaken by the sudden appearance of a stranger. "Do you not recognize me? You are the witch who visited Sophia and I." "Yes."
You once asked me to greet you as a friend, but I am so much more than that." She stepped forward into the light of Neighbor's sparkle, and with a flourish threw back her hood. "Mother!" he cried. "What?" "Yes, my son, I am a witch. I've come to warn you. Don't stop me, Mother." "I won't. This is your moment. Time to decide your own future. If you choose to win Sophia's hand, which I approve of, by the way, you must be prepared to risk everything. Queen Hagatha will destroy you if she can. Do not trust her." "What about Sarah?" Calvin was thrilled to know his mother was watching over him, but a few more allies would make him feel safer. "My niece Sarah is a very capable witch. You can trust her to do what is best for the Shadow Kingdom. That does not always mean what is best for you, so be wise, my son." Calvin ran to her and hugged in a way he had not for years. "Thank you, Mother. Thank you." She luxuriated in her son's love for an eternal second, then ended the embrace and turned to the northwest. "I hear hoofbeats in the distance. Your lead is not so great that they might not catch you. Go now. Find your destiny." With those words she melted into a wide and deep pool of water. Her edges filled the small thicket and would force the others to go far around. Calvin leapt into the saddle, silently thanked his mom for the help, and raced for the finish. Twilight melted into weak sun, and Calvin could see the tall, dark form of the stalls in the distance. Neighbor put on a final burst of speed, such that the prince could merely hold tight. Then he saw something that sickened him. 200 yards ahead were a pair of riders. They must have used the darkness to leave the proper path and cut off a great loop. Banging into each other was one thing, but this was dishonorable and mean. Calvin screamed over the rush of wind for Neighbor to give it all he had. Now he was 100 yards behind, 50, 10. Gus of South Pisonia and Lug of Pisonia whipped their horses hard, then turned their reins on Neighbor and Calvin. It stung, but only spurred him onward. They all rounded the corner of the palisade together and found a massive moat had been dug between them and the gates. It was filled with water and looked about 20 feet wide. In a panic, Calvin wondered if even a shadow horse could leap so far. 3 horses and 3 riders all left the ground together. Lug's horse began to drop. He would not make it across. Gus leaned far over his horse's head to gain a few inches. Remembering his mother's words to risk everything, Calvin pushed hard in the stirrups and literally flew forward off of Neighbor's back and over his head, arcing through the air as if diving into a pool. Calvin crashed in a heap on the other side of the moat. He was first to cross the line. He had won. Gus veered sideways after landing and cantered to a stop at the edge where his mount could drink. Lug swam up to the bank of the moat and was pulled out by his father, who treated him most unkindly for losing. And Calvin? When Neighbor hit the ground, he just avoided trampling Calvin to pulp. The prince grabbed wildly at the reins and, holding tight, was dragged deep past the gate. They finally came to a stop at the feet of Hagatha, Queen of Shadows. She looked down, crossed her arms in front of her chest, and said with narrowed eyes, "You must be Calvin, Prince of North Pisonia," then barked at her guards, "Bring him!" The throne room was a large square space where the royal horses roamed freely. The queen and king sat above the floor on a golden bench. Those who faced their majesties knelt on a wooden beam. It was painful and humiliating. "What shall we do with you, Prince Calvin?" asked the queen. "You won the royal chase, and so have the right to ask Sophia's hand. You were also banished from my lands for not telling me your name. How shall I keep both my word and my honor?" Calvin had a very smart-aleck response ready, but Sarah, standing behind the queen, shook her head slowly.
Your Majesty, if it is a matter of honor, Prince Calvin was invited to participate in the chase. I was here as a traveler before, not as a prince. Spoken like a politician and a Pisanyan. You would quibble over small words and ideas. If your Majesty— No, she snapped. This insult must be atoned for. If I may, my queen. Sarah stepped forward into the light and bowed low. I have looked into the future. This boy will not serve your purposes, unless— Yes, unless what? Said Hagatha, irritated. Let him gather your rightful inheritance, the crown jewels of all the 7 kingdoms. Surely that would satisfy your Majesty's honor, and prove his worth. The queen sat back, a wicked gleam in her eye. Yes, yes. Calvin, Prince of North Pisannia, as the winner of the royal chase, you may ask for the Princess Sophia's hand in marriage. However, you cannot exercise that right with a doom pronounced over your head. You must atone for your insult to our lawful command. Hagatha glared at him, almost daring him to fulfill the quest she was about to give. Therefore, you shall go to the 6 kingdoms and seek out the lost crown jewels of old Pacama. Only if you are successful may you return and claim your bride. A disturbance arose in the far corner of the room. Shouting mixed with the clash of steel as Sophia burst into their presence. She was armed to the teeth and ready for a fight. And what if I don't want to marry this oaf, this thin, ugly, melon-headed— Finding herself at a loss for insults, she chose the one most likely to please her mother. Pisanyan! You will do as you are told, daughter. Now leave. Leave? Leave? While you discuss my future without me? Fine, I'll leave. A cloud of flaming red hair spun in the air and strode out the door. Something about this struck Calvin as being very fishy. He'd never known Sophia to give up on anything so easily. You have been given your quest, Calvin of Pisannia. Go now. May you return in honor and success, or not at all. The prince saluted the queen and king in turn, walked backwards out of the throne room, and rushed to find neighbor. Things had become quite a bit more dangerous than he'd expected. Stepping into the bright morning, Calvin found his horse on the steps of the castle. He and the beautiful mare Andromeda were held by a shorter, thin stable boy, wearing a travel cloak and large hat. A single ringlet of bright red hair peeked out. We should go quickly, the boy said, before they discover I am gone. Well said, my friend, Calvin replied with a huge grin. I look forward to another adventure with you. Just then an alarm bell sounded in the guard shack, followed by shouts and the sound of running feet. Calvin and Sophia laughed as they mounted their companions and sped out of the front gates. A dozen mounted soldiers followed at full gallop. Stop her! Stop the princess by order of the queen! Sophia lifted her hat so that the long tresses could fly back in the wind. She threw it backwards and struck the lead pursuer in the face. Tell my mother that I choose my own destiny. We will return, she shouted back to them. Andromeda and Neighbor were the 2 greatest horses in all the 7 kingdoms. They ran neck and neck long after the guards had given up the chase. Sophia led them to the very same grove in which they had camped so many weeks ago, and by the next night they entered the gate leading to Holly Spring. High on the mountain, unseen by anyone, stood Constance, Queen of North Pisannia, and Sarah, court witch to shadows. Between them rested the great black dragon. They had observed the escape below with interest. You will watch over my son? Asked the queen. And my niece, added Sarah. Of course, your majesties, answered Baird the magician as he transformed. We magic users must protect the humans, mostly from themselves. The end.